Hello, and welcome to this on-demand session from Artlogic Connect, which took place in September 2025. We're so glad you're here. This year's conference welcomed over 4,200 people from across the globe, making Connect one of the largest online gatherings in the art world, a space where our community shared ideas, explored new perspectives, and imagined what's next for the market, a positive, opportunity-filled future. Artlogic is proud to host Connect as part of our mission to support the arts community and help every corner of the art ecosystem thrive. We're delighted to share this session with you so you can revisit the insights, the conversations shaping today's art world, all at your own pace. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to How Does an Artist Build a Legacy? Today we'll be in conversation with Rick Lowe, artist who is based in Houston, who not only started community-based projects like Project Row Houses and Victoria Square Project, but also has a dynamic contemporary art practice of painting. We'll also be joined today by Lisa from the Holt Smithson Foundation, executive director who oversees those artist legacies. And lastly, we'll be joined by Dan, curator of photography at the Carnegie Museum of Art. And so just to sort of jump right in, right? How does an artist build a legacy? For you all, maybe starting with Lisa, how do you define the word legacy in relationship to the foundation work that you do?
Yeah, it's a really delicious question to start with. I'm a real geek, and I think whenever we think about what we do, we need to really consider what it means. So what is legacy? Well, legacy to me, with my subjectivities, is really ensuring that an artist's art and ideas resonate long into the future. And I really strongly believe that when an artist makes the jump to make artwork, their legacy is in that work. And the only way that legacy can remain necessary and relevant is if we critically engage with it. So what does that mean? It means asking the really difficult questions. So we always say at Holt Smithson Foundation, where we look after the legacies of two artists, Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson, we do not want to pickle their work in the vinegar of 1970. We want to say, okay, what is this artwork doing today? What are the problems? And I don't know if you all agree with me, but I love problems because I think problems are about complications. And the reason why I love art so much is that it deals with the difficulties of what it is to be human. And no matter who you are, we can all agree that being human is impossibly difficult. And that's part of art's power. So legacy is about being difficult, complicated, frowning a lot, and never falling into assumptions or, that's just the way it is.
Dan, from an institutional perspective, right, sort of dealing with photography in particular, right, which is, a medium that really is about sort of this idea of technology, right? So as technology has changed, photography has changed. How do you think about legacy in relationship to the medium?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Thank you, Antoine. And I think ultimately when I'm thinking about photography, I'm thinking more about the spirit of the medium, what are the key functions that photography can serve, and what are the roles that it plays, not just historically, but in our current lives. And trying to find where, if any, there are boundaries between the pictures that we are all snapping on our phones and digesting all the time versus the pictures that we hang in frames on the wall of the museum is it's a complicated one. And I think specifically the way that we try to answer that question programmatically at the institution is by being one that is artist centric. We want to be known as a museum where an artist can realize a project to its fullest potential, and we want to make sure that we are, similar to what Lisa said, welcoming oftentimes difficult questions and conversations, things that maybe put us out of our comfort zone a little bit, but trusting that the artist is leading us in that direction, in part because those are the important questions that we need to be having and talking about.
And Rick, for you, right? So someone who sort of began their career as a painter and then shifted to doing community-based projects like Project Row Houses in Houston, where the community becomes the artwork, right? And becomes a part of the production of the artwork, right? And so you have this sort of community background, but then also sort of returning back to painting as a studio, based artist. How are you thinking about this question of legacy in those respective sort of spheres as a studio, traditional, painter, and then sort of your work in the community, which is ongoing?
Yeah, I really thank you, Antoine. I really appreciated Lisa's definition of how she thinks about legacy, and for me, it's almost like I'm having to navigate two different legacies, or having different strategies for different legacies, because the community engaged work, that practice, the legacy exists within the people that were affected by it, because they are the people that were, they're the medium, they're part of the work, so it moves through them, and then there's the legacy around the painting practice, which is it's completely different. The legacy both live within the work, but the work is different. One is in a static form of paintings, and the other is in a ephemeral form of community. And so it's just kind of an interesting. It's complex, and also when Lisa was saying it's when things are complex, that's part of life, and I think that's what's important about that. That's part of growth. When it's complex, it means that we're growing because we're having to struggle with life. So,
in a contemporary sense, right, this sort of idea of legacy as it relates to artists and institutions and foundations have sort of taken on a veneer of, let's say, preservation, right? And so part of that work, when you're thinking about legacy, you're thinking about preserving, right? And preserving that for, not only sort of preserving a past for past sake, but also preserving it for a future, right? And so to sort of think about sort of this notion of preservation, what are the challenges around sort of preserving, the respective legacies that, you all sort of have the gift of, championing, but also expanding, but preserving, from, the community perspective, right? Not misrepresenting, sort of community needs, but also from, two artists, that sort of worked in a very particular period with very particular concerns. Then also from an institutional standpoint, right, where the institutional interest, may not always align with an artist, right, and sort of working through, those sort of complications to sort of make sure that, the original artist's intent or communal or intent is sort of preserved in the contemporary. How do we sort of approach, that sort of tension?
I think I'm going to answer this in a way that's going to be perhaps a bit controversial, but let's roll with that. I once went to an incredible lecture by the architectural historian Mark Cousins, and he talked about exhibition. So we all know what exhibitions are. It's when the artwork goes out, it's seen. And then he posed a question that I think I will never forget. He said, "What about inhibition?" And his argument is that when an artwork is in the studio, it's inhibited. And we all know what that's like. We might go to some kind of party or event and we feel a bit shy and we don't want to talk to anyone, so no one talks to us and we just sit in the corner feeling a bit miserable. Then there's other times when we feel exhibited, where we want to be sociable, we want to think about the ecology. So I think when an artwork leaves the artist studio and it's out in the world, and I'm going to steal your phrase, Rick, and I'm going to be doing this all week now. The artwork moves through people. It sits within an ecology of ideas that are constantly changing. So I would always argue, and this is my controversial bit, that to be true to an artist's intention, you need to enable the artwork to sit within that ecology of criticism, the fact that the world changes, the fact that institutions are there to present artwork, but they're also there to create friction, to push against. So I think preservation is about preserving that core aspect of dialogue, of difficulty, of making sure that the artwork speaks and also listens to the world. And I think, and again, this is, I know, is a controversial point, sometimes when an artwork is made, it's doing one thing. The world changes and it does something else. So for us at Holt Smithson Foundation, we think a lot about Robert Smithson's pre-1964 works. They were made pre-1964. They were one thing then. Now, when we look at them with the eyes of 2025, we can see that he was working with a queer sensibility that was not explicit because it was another time. Whereas now, when we look at them, we can go, it's really clear what he was communicating. So I think preservation is enabling, encouraging, and really igniting artwork to spark with multiple versions of the present, while noting the past versions of the present, this sense of constant change, constant development.
And Dan, you have a large Charles Tinney Harris archive, right? Who is an incredible artist, mid-century artist, who took a lot of images for the local newspaper there, but also on his own accord. And you became recently, several years ago, the inheritor of this archive, the steward of this archive, right? And the digitalization process and all of that. And you invited Bradford Young, who is a contemporary artist, a filmmaker, and DP, to sort of use that archive as a point of departure for a project that he did at the museum, I think in 2017, 2018, if I'm
That's right.
not wrong. How do you sort of, in an institutional setting, thinking about preservation, how do you make those archives, say Tinney Harris archive and any other archives you have in the museum, how do you make that stuff live, right? Because there's this tension with preservation where it, in certain institutional settings, what ends up happening, folks that have, in the name of preservation, only have access, who are doing sort of scholarly research or, what have you, which is, a way, I think, personally, that sort of blocks off, the true potential of, the work, if only a certain segment of the, educated population or whatever gets sort of access to it. And so maybe using, the Harris archive as an example, how do you think about sort of preservation in a way that sort of allows for as many publics as possible to reach that work?
Yeah, I mean, it is critical to the work. And in many ways, I think about it and talk about it in a dialogic sense. And it can be easy, relatively, to have a conversation with a contemporary artist like Bradford Young, where he can say what he wants for his artwork, and we can respond to that and find ways in which maybe the Charles Tinney Harris photographs intersect with it. Obviously, it can be harder when the artist is not living. And that's the case with Charles Tinney Harris. However, it's important to remember that he was part of a community. And we talk about the Harris Archive as a community archive, which means a couple things. One, it is here for the community because it comes out of the community. And we've hosted programs asking questions like, what does it mean to see yourselves on the walls of a museum? Literally asking our public, what do you think about when we put pictures of you, your family members, your loved ones here in a gallery in a museum? I think it also it talks about this idea of community archiving talks about this idea that it is a dialogue between the museum and its public, and that we rely on the public to tell us who was in these photographs and what was happening in them and when they were made. And so capturing oral histories is a huge part of that, of course. And even just having an email address where visitors, and this happens all the time, almost on a daily basis, can come into this museum and say, I know who that is, or I know where that was. And they can literally email us and we will update our cataloging information so that that information gets preserved and accompanies those photographs forever. And then I think there's also this dialogue between Harris as an artist at his time and with a new show that we've literally just opened this past week called Black Photojournalism, trying to situate Harris within a broader continuum of Black newspaper photographers. And there we were able to see that there are other archives that we were able to be in dialogue with all around this country, where community photographers were working for the local Black-owned newspapers and magazines in New York, Atlanta, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. I mean, you name it. There was a photographer working there, and a body of knowledge in a community that person was documenting and preserving. And so by situating Harris within this broader continuum, we're also trying to expand our understanding of a very important post-war historical moment that I think in many ways has been overlooked, and maybe even in this very moment is trying to be erased. So we want to make sure that people understand this happened. We have photographs. These people existed and were creating life and history that we need to remember. And we bring that forward actually with contemporary art projects in this exhibition, including a newspaper from Kwame Omari, where he's remixing images from the show, and then artist books from Liz Archer Johnson, where she is also taking photographs and making them into artist books on textiles that can be handled and flipped through. So we pursue so many different strategies with this archive because we understand that its legacy is both historic and contemporary and everything in between.
And Rick, I have a two-parter for you around this question of preservation as it relates to legacy, right? So the cornerstone of, for those who are listening, who are not familiar with Project Row Houses, the cornerstone of that project are these 22 shotgun houses, or the sort of foundation, let's say, because it's grown and does a lot of different things. Can you talk about sort of in those early days, just the sort of the sort of brass tacks preservation of those spaces, right? Like how did you go about that, right? And then the other sort of aspect of it, the other sort of part of the question rather, is that in your work, right, in certain series of your painting, you're sort of thinking about this notion of preservation. And I was wondering if you can sort of talk a little about how then does that show up, that notion of preservation show up in sort of this more abstracted way in the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The beginning of Project Row Houses, really came out of this notion of an architectural form, the shotgun house, which is actually, it's turned kind of interesting to talk about this in the context of legacy. We're building a legacy around a particular kind of architecture too, which is which most people, don't know very much about the shotgun house, but Project Row Houses is bringing that forth. And that project came out of, the pure will of a handful of artists connecting with a community and trying to create that kind of broad base of relevance to both, kind of in the way that Dan was talking about, that is relevant for the art form of it, but it's also relevant for a community that it's connecting with. And so, over the years of constantly connecting with community and building that project has kind of created a real sense of a legacy for this particular community. But as an artist, for me, thinking about the ephemeral nature of a lot of these works that I've done, they happen and they kind of disappear, and they only exist in the stories that people have, or things that have been written about them, and so on and so forth. So I decided that since I was moving back into painting, that I would actually take the opportunity for the paintings to actually recall some of those projects in ways, that give people a link to discovery of other legacies that are connected to my career.
Mm-hmm. And so in some of your works, right, like you have used sort of ephemera or sort of photographs and images of the shotgun house, and so thinking about sort of that sort of figurative material, that historical material, how are you thinking about that in relationship to a history of abstraction or preservation?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the thing about using the material of those projects, it's they have such strong narratives within themselves that as an artist, I can take the liberty of deconstructing those narrative and opening it up for people who engage with the paintings, that they can experience it in a completely different way than the direct narrative of what happens in that community. And that for me, hopefully it opens up the opportunity for them to be able to look at some of the other ephemeral artworks or things that are happening in their own context, that's not even really related to the directly to the work that I'm producing.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, because I have an artist, a curator, and a director of a foundation, it's like this is sort of the group of people, right, that sort of defines, fights over, extends, contracts, this notion of a artist legacy, right? And I think that like one of the things that's sort of interesting, Lisa in particular, and Rick with sort of the physical structures, right? And a photo archive, right? And sort of like, if we're using Teenie Harris as an example, right? Like a lot of those images were needed to be processed, right? And there was a lot of just like film. And then with, with Holt and Smithman, they made a lot of land work, right? And the elements are going to sort of do what they do over time with works like that. You have, the shotgun house, when you came upon them, when they needed to be restored. They needed, sort of all these things to sort of make them fit for mothers and for after school projects and artists and, and so just thinking about sort of how expensive a legacy is, right? And sort of the preservation of the literal sort of brass tacks preservation. What are the strategies, that you guys are thinking about in relationship to, that sort of like, it takes a lot of money to sort of, sort of sustain a legacy, right? How are you thinking about that in relationship to your respective, the work that you sort of do in your institutions or in your studio in the community in relationship to like just sustaining? Like, what are some strategies that you have used to sort of, make sure that the legacy can be remembered?
I mean, that's the real brutal fact. Oh, sorry. This is the real brutal fact. Then it costs money, but then simply existing costs money. So in a way, I think that if one is looking after a legacy, it costs as much as when the artist was around to continue that. But I want to answer your question in a slightly different way. Like, there's resources, there's two things we never have enough of: money and time. There's also time as well. And what we're doing at Holt Smithson Foundation, we made a decision when we became active in 2018. We as a foundation will only exist for a short period of time. So we've set ourselves the challenge that we are going to dissolve before 2038, which is 100 years after both artists were born. And the reason why I want to mention this is it speaks to a few things that we've talked about. In terms of resources, we are not a wealthy foundation. Neither Nancy Holt nor Robert Smithson came from money. Neither Nancy Holt nor Robert Smithson make classic sellable works. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a real politics in this, that legacy is often at its loudest when there is inherited wealth behind an artist and so on. So we made the decision, by existing for 20 years, our job is to make our foundation completely obsolete so that other people continue that work. and it's partly financial, but it's also poetic as well. We don't see ourselves as clutching our collection as if it's our own. We want it to be out in the world, talking with other artistic practices, in museums, in other foundations, in the world. So we really see our key resources being time. And maybe time is something that really is part of all great artwork. I sometimes joke with my coworkers and I say, look, we need to list the medium of spiral jetty as being rumor as well, because the rumor is so important. This is an artwork that will disappear, but it will stay in collective memory through the rumor. And we all know rumor is just as powerful as stone or bone in terms of legacy.
And one other thing sort of following up is how then, you mentioned spiral jetty, which is also, the rumor is very real around that word, but also it requires not only sort of, I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere, so like it requires sort of a real pilgrimage, but also it's a relationship that you have with Dia Foundation, right? And so you talk about sort of how you work with the public and institutions to sort of further the institutional legacy of an artist.
Well, with Spiral Jetty, it's part of Dia's collection. Dia are the steward. And I would say that Dia are the primary steward of artworks in places outside of metropolitan centers. And there's two things that I really try and avoid, two words that I try and avoid using when it comes to Spiral Jetty. One is pilgrimage and the other one is remote. I think pilgrimage assumes that it's some kind of, I don't know, reverent trip to see Spiral Jetty. When anyone goes to see it, the first thing they always say, and it's rather like meeting a movie star, they always say, you know, it's smaller and older than I thought it was going to be. And it's not what I expected. But then when you take your photographs and you look at them at home, it looks as stunning as it does in the rumor mill of photography. And it's the same when you come across a movie star. You might think they're older and fatter and shorter than they were going to be. You take a picture with them and they look amazing. And then to this question of remote, the reason why I always push against that is we always have to qualify the term remote. Remote from what? So Spiral Jetty at the Great Salt Lake is remote from where I'm sitting, Santa Fe, New Mexico. But it's not remote from the small town that is really, really close to it. And this is really important to my heart because I was born in a very so-called remote place from metropolitan centers, but it wasn't remote from where we were. And I think it's that sense, and again, Rick, I'm going to be saying this phrase again and again, that art moves through people, and the people might be nearby. So I think that's also part of the medium of the work, is saying, well, what do these terms mean? And it really comes back to where we started our conversation by thinking, what does legacy mean? It means talking around and with and problematizing.
Dan, you were going to add something.
Well, I was going to your first part of the question about some of the strategies that we use to provide these resources. One way that, of course, with 80,000 negatives by Charles Teeny Harris in this archive, we have now digitized everything. All of those images are available on our website. And necessarily to offset the costs of that digitization and the ongoing stewardship of the collection, we license these photographs. We also, though, try to have a bit of a flexible system. So we do license certain images with Getty Images, and we provide Getty with a set of very strict guidelines as to how the images can be used. And then we have many local partnerships and museum partnerships with organizations here in Pittsburgh and beyond that want to utilize Harris's photographs because maybe it shows the building that they're in, or it shows an individual that they're featuring in a program. And so we have to have the flexibility there to say, we don't need to charge for this licensing. This is a partner organization that we want to support and that has every right to this Harris image as much as we do. And so regularly we are we're working with a team of colleagues evaluating those requests that come in from local churches, hotels, you name it, and saying, yes, absolutely, you're free to use these images. Here they are, no charge. And yes, we do sometimes have to offset those costs by charging large corporations that want to use a Harris image for their website. But we view it as a sort of trade that we're willing to make. And then obviously it is challenging to know and to express to our communities that having these photographs is not cheap. We do have to make sure that they are preserved for posterity, and they have to have the appropriate climate controls and storage cabinets and ongoing information, cataloging information, and all that costs money. So we do try to find ways that we can offset those costs, but understand that we can't. This is not a cash cow. This is not something that we just need to make money off of.
It's the sort of licensing aspect, which is something new that in this sort of conversation or field that I did not realize that was something that was possible. Is that something that the museum pioneered? Is that something that is sort of standard with sort of photo archive? Because it's genius, right? Because those are images that were sort of created in a public context, right? He shot for newspapers, and
Absolutely.
So to turn it back, right, to sort of license it to Getty or whatever is sort of a really, I think, very smart way to sort of approach this question of like, okay, we have preservation costs, and this is how we're going to do this, but it still exists sort of in the spirit of the in which the work was made.
Yeah, I think, I don't know of any specific other models just like this at museums. And it does require a lot of work. Another example of this is that we do sell certain of the photographs printed in our gift shop. But we have had instances where someone comes in and says, that's my uncle in the photograph. Can I have a copy of it? And in which case we say, absolutely, here it is, free of charge. Of course, this is your family photograph. That's not for us to own this image. So, it is something that we have been working very hard on in the last few years to really be sensitive to ways in which we can support this collection monetarily, but understand that it has value way beyond that we need to make sure is guaranteed as well.
Rick, you were going to add something.
No, I was just going to just bring up some of the complexities with ephemeral work, the legacies around that. 'Cause I often think about there's the artist's intent, that is really valuable to us, right? But as it continues to go, and the further down the line it goes. So I just think of I often question how will Project Row Houses represent my legacy of founding Project Row Houses in 2050, or 2060, something like that, long after I've, my involvement has been gone. And then, as I was thinking about that and considering that, I went back to the notion of, Joseph Boy's concept of social sculpture was the conceptual basis for me to engage with Project Row Houses. And I was thinking, and I was wondering, I wonder what Joseph Boys would think about my interpretation of its social sculpture. It might not be carrying the legacy in the way that he envisioned the legacy, but I think that's just part of and I guess that goes to the thing of rumor too, right? When it becomes rumor, it does kind of move in many different directions. And but for me, I think ultimately the key thing is that it exists for people to go back to, and there will be people that will want to go back and find, the purest form, the purest element of and representation of that work at its point of conception, and but it has to live through all these different interpretations.
Yeah, and one
that,
of the things, go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
I was just going to say, this is something that I feel like I'm a stuck record on. I think it's so important for artists, and I'm looking you right in the eye now, Rick, is that you write down exactly what your intentions are. So that there's this reference that can be gone back to. And of course it will mutate, and in 2050, 2060, 2070, people will reinterpret and misinterpret your work. But having that point that can be gone back to or ignored is so important. And Project Row Houses, I think, is just such an important project within our era of art making. And I feel like I'm going to be like a dog with a bone chasing you now, saying you need to get that fixed, written down before you even change your mind on it, which of course artists do.
Absolutely.
I would personally encourage that, Lisa. We're sort of having such a great conversation. We have some questions. I'm going to ask a few, and then we'll sort of come back and sort of discuss. But just one more thing on sort of the financial point. One of the things that when I first visited Project Row Houses that was sort of really interesting to me was that the actual houses have a foundation that supports each of sort of the making that's going on in there, right? And so have local and national, businesses and foundations that have sort of come together to sort of help support, that community's, the sort of what's happening on a very granular level in each of those sort of houses and beyond, right? Because I think the project now has stretched, across the community and, in all these really sort of interesting ways. But just to sort of round up sort of that point, the first question we have.
Wait, Antoine, let me just say quickly, what is interesting that you brought that up, because, for me, as I'm thinking about artists' legacies, generally it relies on institutions, whether it's museums, galleries, collectors, and these kinds of things. And I never really thought of those sponsors or people that we engage in that way are really a part of that institutional support that's supporting legacy. So that's a very important thing that I didn't really think about.
Exactly, like that sort of support and and just sort of coming together. Denise asked, thank you all for being so thoughtful with your questions. Rick and Antoine, I hope you can address how you balance commercial projects and your respective practices. Lisa, I'm interested in your opinion on the same topic with regard to land artists. Maybe Rick, you can address how do you balance the commercial and the communal?
Yeah, well, for me, it's the community part of my work is broad-based. I mean, I've always looked at the local being the center, but there are many concentric circles of people that are involved in the project and in the work, and they're all integral to it. And then, so moving into the commercial realm, it's just another extension of that. That circle of support, circle of interest, and that keeps the work alive and keep it available. So, I see that as just a natural progression.
And there's another question from Madeline. From a practical perspective, as a living artist, how do you approach archiving and preserving your materials for the future? Or is this something you choose not to focus on?
Is that me again?
That's for you. That's for you, okay. The artist. Yeah.
Okay. Well, fortunately, I have a second chance at this because my first 10 years of painting, I had no regard for the idea of legacy. I pushed against completely the institutions of art, the traditional institutions of art. All the work that I made, I basically allowed it to be destroyed and, scavenged by other people and all. And but this time around, I'm trying to be a little bit more thoughtful because life is, it's important. As time goes on, people want to reference those things. And so with Project Row Houses, there's a great, archive, all of that. And of course, I'm, working with my gallery to make sure that all the painting stuff that I'm doing now, that it's all cataloged, it's all there,
right.
Where it's going and all of that. So
I also think that's sort of an interesting point where I never thought about your career in that way, where sort of like early in the career when you were sort of making work that was, more public, right? Paintings for sort of gatherings and protest and sort of things like that, right? There was a sort of ephemera nature to it, right? And so when we were putting together your monograph, your recent monograph, and we were sort of creating sort of a timeline of the career, and there was folks who reached out, and there was on a few instances said, I have this thing that he made that's on cardboard that and so we got to take photos of it and sort of catalog that. But Dan, you were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, from an institutional perspective or a museum perspective, we love it when artists are thinking about their legacy and trying to preserve as much as possible, because then it makes it so much easier for us when we want to showcase that work to do it according to the artist's wishes. And I don't think this doesn't only pertain to successful blue chip gallery artists. This is anyone. If you're capturing digital photographs, for example, as we all know, it's so easy to snap that picture and then have it disappear into the cloud, and maybe you flip through it on your phone, but that's sort of it. But if you want an institution to be thinking about that and stewarding it and collecting it, then we need to know that information. We need to know who made the image and why and when and where, and all of that, what we might call metadata. It matters. And so, as an artist, I think it's so important to be thinking about those things. As Lisa said, put it in writing, or reach out to the museum that has your work and say, hey, I just want to make sure that I really want this work to be shown in this way or in this context or whatever, because that just helps us as interpreters of that legacy in the future. It just makes our jobs easier. So we welcome it.
And Lisa, I have a question that maybe you can answer from Mariana. When we talk about legacy, we usually think about artists who are already well known and established in the art world. For younger artists or those who are still building their institutional presence or represented by smaller galleries, are there any strategies, steps, or connections that are particularly important to help guide them on the path to building their legacy?
It's a really nice question.
Advice for the younger artists, folks who are either represented by younger galleries or aren't represented at all, when they're sort of thinking about being remembered, or and I think we should sort of couch this in the context that a lot of artists have in the last 5-10 years have been let's say rediscovered is the word that they're sort of using, or and so how do you sort of if it doesn't happen in your lifetime, how do you set it up for the next?
I think the most important thing for all artists is to concentrate on making their work.
Mm-hmm.
That is what matters, and all the other stuff is secondary to making the work. So I would always say, and again, sometimes I think the number one line in my job description is to be annoying. But I really feel that it's essential for artists to put their work first. Legacy building, if you focus more on the legacy than the work, then you don't have the work to create the legacy. So I would say to artists, just keep stuff. Even if it's in some kind of, closet in your home or in the back corner of the studio, keep this stuff. Because at some point it will be necessary for someone else to go through it. But I would really recommend to Mariana that it's just important to make your work and not get too caught up in legacy in the future and what comes next. To be in the present and to make work that matters, because this is what we're all in this realm for the work. Because artwork is, I will always insist, it's an intellectual activity that really changes perceptions. And I don't think art can change the world, yet art can change perceptions. And if you can change perceptions, you can radically reformulate the way that we understand our present, our past, and our future.
There is we're coming up on time, but I'm going to try to sort of condense a few questions. One is about, from Gustavo, about how do you interact with families, right? And we talked a bit about an artist's intent, writing it down. What if a family member comes and say, actually, I'd rather not have that piece of information out there, despite the fact that the artist wanted it out there, right? How do you sort of deal with sort of that aspect of, maybe from the institution and the foundation side, like how do you deal with sort of, maybe there's a brother or a sister or a parent or who wasn't necessarily involved in the practice, but want to later exert some kind of control, or how do you sort of think through those thorny sort of issues?
I can speak a little bit to.
Please, you go down.
No, it's fine. I'll just say again, coming back to the Harris archive, Harris had several children. They're still alive. There is a very large family, and as stewards of his archive, we are in dialogue with them all the time. And again, we rely on them for information and direction. And so we have not been in the position where a family member says, I want this for the archive, and it is in contradiction to what Harris or the archive itself wants. It has always been one that happens in dialogue, and always with the goal of preserving and promoting his photographs. So I think as long as you have that dialogue going, and as long as it is one that is obviously time helps there as well, right? If it's an ongoing conversation, then we can better understand what the family wants, and also we can better advocate for the things that we as the museum need. And I was thinking as Lisa was talking about Andy Warhol, another Pittsburgh boy, someone who was famous for creating his time capsules, where he literally just took a banker's box and swept everything off of his desk in the studio once a month, and then set those boxes to the side. Well, now the Andy Warhol Museum here in Pittsburgh, our partner organization, is going through those time capsules. And I think for Warhol, it was all part of his practice. It was all his art. He knew it was important. He didn't have the time to go through it and categorize it and label it. He swept it into a box and let somebody else do that. And now we're doing that, and it is bearing incredible fruit. So, this doesn't have to be something as so meticulous and nitpicky necessarily. The art does have to come first.
I think, go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, with family, it's really, really complicated. I always say that love is irrational. And I also always say to the people who I am closest to, if they're artists, I want nothing to do with their legacy, because I cannot make rational decisions. I think that the importance with an artist's legacy is the work. And I think it's so difficult for family members, whether it's blood family or chosen family, to make those decisions. And perhaps this is one thing, and I'm contradicting myself here, but artists need to be really clear with their loved ones, what responsibility they want them to have. And I would always recommend not to give people that responsibility if there's love involved. It just makes everything difficult. So you might think, I'm thinking in my head of a specific example, you might really want to, if you're talking about the legacy of a loved artist, you might think, this is such an important drawing, but it's important because you were there when the artist made it, and you have these special memories of the sunshine and the laughter. That's separate from the work. So I think it's difficult, and this is somewhere else where artists can really help their legacy by not giving their loved ones this burden, because it's expensive, it's hard, it's stressful, and it's not always that much fun.
We've come up on time, so I'll ask one more question, and then we'll kick it back over to the good folks at Artlogic. What is one thing, now that we sort of talked about experience and talked through some of the questions, what is one piece of advice that you wish you had known in your respective roles at the very beginning of your careers around this notion of building a legacy?
Well, I've already kind of given mine a little bit. I wish I had. Well, when you're young, you don't think you're gonna live beyond 30. When you're in your 20s, so you just think, oh, whatever. But then, so I let 10 years of my career just kind of, just disappear in a sense. I mean, there's documentation of it, but it's going to be a real uphill battle to try to bring that, to find all that stuff. But it's there, and but I would, if I were doing it again, I would pay more attention to that.
Fair.
I think the other side of the other side of that coin for me is you have to be forgiving to yourself. There's no way to predict the future. You can only do what you can do. You make the decisions based on the information you have at hand. And if it means that you missed the boat on something or you didn't do something quite right, that's just the way that it is. And you have to be okay with that. At the end of the day, you have to be able to sleep at night. So you got to be generous to yourself and forgive yourself.
And I think I would say giving time to time. Everything takes 10 times, not 3 times, 10 times as long as you think. So just give it time.
There we have it. I wanted to thank Dan, Lisa, and Rick for this inspiring conversation about how artists builds a legacy and preserves a legacy, and sort of working through the foundation, the studio, the community, and the museum around these questions. And I'm going to turn it over to John to keep us going today.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the panel for this incredible discussion. Lots of things to take away from it. Please join us in an hour for our next session, which is contemporary art in the age of AI. And we'll discuss kind of how AI is reshaping what it means to curate and to exhibit, and the impact of embodiment of authorship and identity. So please join us in an hour. Thank you to the panelists and to our moderator, Antoine. And look forward to seeing you in our next session.
Thanks.
Thank you.